Somewhere in what is now Mongolia, roughly 75 million years ago, a creature the size of a large dog dug itself into a collapsing sand dune and never came back out. When paleontologists found it, decades later, its arms were still raised, frozen mid-motion, locked in a position that, at first glance, looked almost peaceful. But the more scientists studied it, the less peaceful that death became. What if I told you that this animal may have suffocated slowly, buried alive by a storm of sand, fully conscious, for minutes that must have felt like hours? And what if I told you this isn't even the only candidate for the most agonizing death in the fossil record? There are others. A dinosaur drowned in quicksand while a predator's jaws were still locked around its throat. A juvenile tyrannosaur that may have died from a bone infection so severe it altered the animal's skull. A raptor, fossilized forever in combat, its killing claw driven into the throat of its prey. Both animals dying together, buried by a dune that swallowed the fight itself. Which of these was truly the worst way to die? And how could we possibly know what pain even meant to a mind that vanished millions of years before humans existed? That's the question at the center of everything we're about to explore. I've spent a long time with this question, and I'll be honest, it doesn't have a clean answer, but that's exactly what makes it worth investigating. Let's start with the sand. The fossil I mentioned is one of the most famous specimens in paleontology, nicknamed the sleeping dragon, a small, feathered oviraptor orsosaur found curled over its own nest, winged.
For years, this posture was read as an act of parental devotion, frozen at the exact moment disaster struck. That interpretation still holds up remarkably well, but what actually killed the animal is where things get complicated. Mongolia's Gobi Desert during the late Cretaceous wasn't the empty expanse it is today. It was a landscape of shifting dunes, seasonal storms, and sudden, violent sandslides, geological events that could bury an animal in seconds. Researchers studying the sedimentary layers around these fossils have proposed that many of these animals were killed not by predators, not by disease, but by the ground itself, collapsing without warning. Try to imagine that moment. No warning growl, no shadow overhead, just the world giving way beneath you, sand pouring in faster than you can dig yourself free. Some researchers argue the burial was rapid enough to be nearly instantaneous, a mercifully quick death. Others point to the animal's raised limbs and arched posture as evidence of a final, desperate struggle, an animal still fighting, still trying to breathe, as the sand closed over it. We genuinely don't know which version is correct, and I think that uncertainty is worth sitting with rather than rushing past. Before we go further, it's worth asking, what kind of animal are we even talking about? Oviraptorosaurs were an unusual branch of the dinosaur family tree, feathered, beaked, often toothless, built more like an enormous flightless bird than the reptilian monsters of old textbooks. Their name literally means egg thief, a label pinned on the very first specimen discovered, back when scientists assumed it had died raiding another dinosaur's nest.
It took almost 70 years and the discovery of specimens brooding over eggs that were later confirmed as their own to realize the science had gotten the story backward. This wasn't a thief, it was a parent. That single correction changed how paleontologists think about dinosaur behavior entirely. If a dinosaur could sit on a nest, shielding eggs with its own body during a lethal storm, then dinosaur parenting, dinosaur devotion even, was far more sophisticated than anyone had assumed. And that raises the question this documentary keeps circling back to. What was actually happening inside that animal's mind in its final moments? We can't know for certain. No fossil records emotion. But we can reconstruct the biology behind it, the brain structure, the sensory world, the nervous system, and from that, build an evidence-based picture of what suffering, or its absence, might have looked like. Now let's talk about a very different kind of death. In 1971, in the same Gobi region, paleontologists uncovered one of the most extraordinary fossils ever found, a velociraptor and a protoceratops locked together in combat, preserved in the exact instant of their fight. The raptor's sickle-shaped claw is driven into the throat of its prey. The protoceratops' jaws are clamped around the raptor's arm. Both animals appear to have been buried alive together, likely by that same kind of collapsing dune. Neither predator nor prey walked away.
The predator, potentially suffocating with its arms still trapped in its prey's jaws, or the prey, already wounded, already losing a fight it couldn't win when the ground itself buried it. I don't think there's a comfortable answer. Let's widen the lens for a moment, because pain isn't only about the moment of death. Sometimes it's about what an animal endured while it was still alive. Paleopathologists, scientists who study disease and injury in fossilized bone, have identified Tyrannosaur specimens with signs of a parasitic infection, likely similar to dragomanosis, a condition still seen in birds of prey today. In modern raptors, this infection creates lesions in the throat severe enough to make swallowing agonizing, sometimes fatal through slow starvation rather than a single violent event. If a similar pathogen affected tyrannosaurs, and the bone evidence strongly suggests it did, then some of the most fearsome predators in Earth's history may have died not from combat, not from a rival's jaws, but from a slow internal battle no observer would have ever witnessed. That's a very different kind of horror. Not sudden, not dramatic, just prolonged. Here's where I want to introduce the theory I promised earlier, one of the more unsettling ideas in modern paleontology, and one that reframes almost everything we think we know about how these animals experience the world. For decades, paleoneurologists have used CT scanning to study the internal shape of fossilized skulls, mapping the space once occupied by brain tissue. What they found in several theropod species, including tyrannosaurs, is a surprisingly developed olfactory bulb, the brain region responsible for processing smell.
Some of these predators may have had a sense of smell rivaling modern vultures or bloodhounds. Now combine that with what we know about the infections, the injuries, the slow deaths some of these animals endured. A predator with an extraordinarily refined sense of smell, moving through an environment full of decay, disease, and the scent of its own kind suffering. That's a nervous system built to register far more of its environment than we once assumed dinosaurs were capable of. If that's true, it doesn't just tell us how these animals hunted. It hints at how vividly, how intensely they may have experienced pain, fear, even the presence of death nearby. We can't measure suffering in a fossil. There's no instrument for that. But neuroanatomy gives us the closest thing to a window, and increasingly that window suggests these were not simple, reflexive animals. They were creatures with rich sensory worlds, complex enough that words like suffering may not be as anachronistic as they once sounded. I find that both sobering and strangely humanizing. These were not monsters. They were animals. Living, breathing, occasionally suffering animals, navigating a world every bit as dangerous and at times as cruel as our own. If you want to keep exploring how prehistoric minds worked, how these animals saw, heard, hunted, and felt their way through a world we can only partially reconstruct, that's exactly the kind of expedition we're building here. Consider joining us for what comes next.
Or the one that unfolded slowly, invisibly, inside a body that outwardly looked healthy right up until it wasn't. Science may never give us a single answer, but every fossil we've examined tonight tells the same underlying story, that intelligence, sensitivity, and yes, perhaps even suffering, were present in this world long before we were. And maybe that's the real discovery here, not which death was worst, but that these animals experienced death and life as vividly as anything alive today. If this journey into the minds of the ancient world fascinated you as much as it fascinated me, there's another mystery waiting, another creature, another mind, lost for millions of years, waiting for us to reconstruct what it was like to see, to hunt, to fear, to feel, through eyes that closed long before ours ever opened. Join me for that next expedition.